Well, I'll just make some informal comments because I made a formal presentation yesterday. The point I'd like to drive home that the euro has really broken down. It has sprung defects, some of which could have been anticipated and were anticipated, but some actually couldn't. And effectively, the heavily indebted countries have ended up in the position of a third world country that heavily indebted in a foreign currency. And that's only one of the unanticipated results of how things worked out. The euro crisis is a very complex crisis because it's a sovereign debt crisis, it's a balance of payments crisis, it's a banking crisis, it's a competitiveness crisis, it's a structural defects or being not an optimum currency area, so fundamental in that way too. But the fact is that we are very far from equilibrium. And when I say far from equilibrium, I actually have more than one in mind. I mean, very far from the Maastricht criteria. That's one way of putting it. But actually, it's very far from what I would call rational expectations equilibrium. And rational expectation equilibrium, which doesn't exist, it's a mirage, it's a creation of flight of fancy almost, is when people's understanding of the situation actually corresponds to the situation. And right now, there's a tremendous gap. And that gap was illustrated this morning in the first panel, where you had a representative of the authorities outlining the position of the authorities. He made it clear that he wasn't giving his personal opinion, he was representing the official opinion. And 5 other contributors who each described how abnormal the situation is. And 5 different ways of slicing it, each one quite penetrating, but incomplete, of course, which showed that it's really very far from equilibrium. This cognitive dissonance, I think, is creating a political dynamic which is going to destroy, unless it is somehow corrected, is going to destroy not only the euro, but certainly the Schengen Treaty won't survive, and the common market won't survive, and the European Union itself may end in acrimonious recrimination with worse conflicts between European states than before the creation of the European Union. So that's about as dismal a prospect as you could have. And I genuinely believe that that is where we are heading for. And that's why I am so concerned about this issue. I consider this, in a way, the biggest problem confronting us when there are so many other problems equally troubling and also waits for solution, like climate change. But this one is very urgent. So, so we cannot accept this. And I don't think we should accept it, because history is not predetermined. In other words, it doesn't have to happen. So how can it be stopped? I said in my formal presentation to rediscover the fantastic object that the European Union was when it was only an idea, and then it became an imposition, which it is now. But let me try to be more specific. And that means that you've got to first, or concurrently with changing the rules, learning from the mistakes and improving them, you first somehow have to get back to normal. In other words, you have to find invent some non-existent device that will get us back closer to the Maastricht criteria. And that's normally actually what central banks are supposed to do. In other words, or the monetary authorities, generally speaking, are supposed to do, namely to preserve the system. And sometimes in a crisis, they do things that they had never done before. And we actually have, quantitative easing and things like that, which have never previously been practiced. So that is, I think, the only way. But for that, the authorities and the people in charge have to recognize that this is what needs to be done. And I think that perhaps public opinion, since we are living in democracy, could actually persuade the authorities to do that. And I also published an article yesterday in Financial Times, which actually proposes one of these out-of-the-box ideas. And since I was confined to 850 words, maybe I'd like to sort of explain it just a little bit more of what I was proposing. But and I think it would be an important step. It would be a dramatic transformation of the scene if it were adopted. But of course, it's not a complete remedy for all the crises. It focuses on this particular problem of third world countries that have become heavily indebted in a foreign currency. And this happened because they transferred their seigniorage rights to the ECB. That's why they can't print their own money. And because they can't print their own money, there's a real danger that they would default. A sovereign that can print the money can't default, will never default, because maybe the currency will lose its value or some part of its value, but they can always print the money that's necessary to repay their debts, right? And that's what they can't do now, the members. And that's why you have this risk premium, which has added to their, and is accelerating their indebtedness and pushes them into a vicious circle. So, how could you reduce that? Well, the seigniorage rights could be capitalized. And there have been now a couple of very serious studies of what the parameters which would indicate what the value might be. There is one by Willem Buiter of Citibank, and there is somebody from Goldman Sachs. And each of them independently came up with a reasonable range of values between 2 and 3 trillion euros. So in other words, we are talking real money. And that, you could take that, this belongs to the owners of the ECB. They could put it into a holding company and use that holding company to, well, there are two variants. Let's say the immediate variant would be just simply to take over the obligation of the countries that have exceeded the Maastricht criteria to reduce their borrowings by 1/20th every year. For a country like Italy, that works out to about 3% of GDP. So it's not enough for them to balance the budget. They also have to have a 3% surplus devoted to reducing their indebtedness. That creates an additional burden, and if they did the right things, which actually in the case of Italy they are doing, and also Spain, they could be relieved of this burden by the holding company taking over, buying that debt and forgiving the interest on that debt. Or you could actually do something more radical and reduce, just simply cancel half the debt outstanding by acquiring it in the holding company. So doing that would make it, would reward the countries that are actually following the prescriptions and structural reforms and balancing the budget, and reward them for it. And at the same time, if they fail to do so in the future, this privilege or this concession could be withdrawn. So there would be sticks and rewards. And that would be a more balanced situation, which would actually allow the compact to be introduced with appropriate modifications without driving Europe into this deflationary debt trap, which is now being prepared. So it would be a tremendous relief. Now, as I say, this would not be a complete solution, because you would have to reconsider the fiscal compact, because just as you could see at the time of the Maastricht Treaty that there are some defects. You can already see that the compact is flawed and needs to be modified. And yet, the authorities are refusing any modification, and they are perpetuating this destructive course of trying to preserve a set of rules that is clearly not workable. And that is the political dynamic that's driving us, driving the European Union into a catastrophe. So, therefore, adopting such a step would indicate that the authorities have realized that they've got to do these out of the ordinary things. And then they could do the other things as well that would be needed to make the union work. I won't go into the further details because I'd like to see them do this first one before spending my time thinking about the other ones.
George, thank you very much. I would very much like to put your proposal of the seniorage fund, the SPV, to the panel at the end of this round. Let me ask you just a small technical question about this. A lot of the proposals, the best proposals we've had on the Eurozone, like the bank license for the EFSF and various other proposals, including several that you have made, in the end were not adopted on the grounds, whether real or imaginary is another matter, on the grounds that it is legally not possible. Would a seniorage fund be compatible with the law, with the spirit and letter of Article 123?
Yes, because it's the ECB that's not allowed to buy government bonds directly. The holding company is not the ECB, it's the shareholders of the ECB, namely the member countries.
Right.
And it is up to the member countries to show solidarity. They would be effectively pooling their ownership. And actually, Germany would be joining a transfer union because they are the largest shareholders. So they have the biggest share of the seigniorage. But the distribution would go to the people who are, or the countries that are in a deeper distress. So it would be a transfer union. And I think the German public has to accept that either that any union, monetary, political, a family even, involves transfer payments. So you can't do it without transfer payments. And then you have to make a calculation. Is this worth paying, or would you prefer to not to have this union and go back to the Deutschmark? And I think the sooner they make that decision, the better off everybody would be. Because right now we are on a course that is basically destructive. It's a decline. We are going into a recession and also a political decline. So then, either way, there would be a resolution to what otherwise is a disaster situation.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. So Sven, please.